Hello everybody, I'm Roxy, this is recmebook&stuff, and today I want to tell you about my favorite fiction books of 2020. This list was actually hard to compile because I read amazing books in 2020, which I feel like was not the case with 2019. I mean, I did read some amazing books, but I don't think the fiction reads stayed with me the same way. This list has two honorable mentions, which are Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders and Anakana by Leo Tolsoi. I wanted to include both of them, but they just missed the cut, and they are books that I feel like I should read again in order to, I don't know if properly process them, but just they didn't have the same staying power. But I think that might be because I was very focused on seeing how they worked, and maybe a second read would be just more them over me, if that makes any sense. Probably doesn't, but yeah. Those are my honorable mentions. Let's get on with the books. Number 15 is a play, actually. Gross Indecency by Moisés Kaufman. I read this in December. As I've mentioned in the December wrap-up, link down below and in the eye as always. I thought I wouldn't like this when I started reading it because it was very much styled in the Bertolt Brecht School of Theater, which go watch that video to find out what's up there. But yeah, I actually loved it. I loved how it was arranged, and I don't know, it's just stayed with me. You know, I think about not only the facts, you know, this is about the 3 trials of Oscar Wilde, and it has a very intertextual approach. It uses phrases from the characters or people involved's letters and writings in order to craft this narrative, but it does show the trials, and it's so moving, it's so heartbreaking, but it's also so smart in the way it uses different actors to play different characters and how it arranges the testimonies. It's just so great. I really recommend it. But as I always say, I don't recommend it if you are not used to reading plays. It's not a good place to start because you do need a very active theater imagination to picture how it would play out. Number 14 is one book that I didn't get to talk about in this channel because I read it in January when I was doing research. I just never talked about it because I didn't do a January wrap-up. That is Martin John by Anakana Schofield, I want to say. I first picked this up, I bought it because it was part of the Goldsmith Prize, and I was at a time doing a challenge. I still have it in the back of my mind. I will link the latest Goldsmith video, which is a year old, but still. I like to follow that prize. Every year it is the prize that I'm most excited about all the time. Even if I might be disappointed with some of the choices, I still like to find out what they nominated because it's for experimental fiction. And this is about a guy who is gross, and he is an exhibitionist and he harasses women. You know, tough main character, but it's not making him sympathetic or anything. It is narrated in many different viewpoints, and his viewpoint is third person, whereas there are collective we that represents like the women who are in trial, and there are some other third persons and first persons and second persons even. It's a very choral like book is what I'm saying. While he is a real person, he's not evil or anything. He's just gross and disturbed, but it doesn't make apologies for him. It doesn't try to make him a good guy. It's just a hard book to describe because it is so weird, and you do need to get into it. But once you're into it, that's just it. I couldn't stop reading. I was surprised by how readable it was and how compulsively readable it was because it's such a strange book. You just open it and you see these fragmented bits and you think, oh, this cannot work, but it does. There are some scenes that I still think about and I shudder because they are gross, and especially if you're a woman, it's even grosser. Although it's not necessarily the most pleasant experience, it is a very lasting experience, and I really like the writing of it and how from very immediate and direct and fragmented writing, you get broader ideas and you get a whole narrative arc. It's very strange but very accomplished, and I really recommend it if that sounds like your cup of tea. Then we have Lady Susan by Jane Austen. This was the year I read most Jane Austen. I reread Emma, I reread Sense and Sensibility, I read Persuasion, read The Beautiful Cassandra, so lots of Jane Austen this year, which makes me really happy because I really like her writing. Didn't like Persuasion at all. But I loved Lady Susan, which is an epistolary novel about a mother who is very controlling, and she's like a cougar mom. And it's so interesting how through these letters you see her perception of things is so skewed, or maybe she knows her perception is skewed, but she still misrepresents things to her friend. And then you see some other letters to other correspondents, and you see how they are also different. And it's so difficult, I think, to create convincing epistolary novels where all the characters sound different and at the same time they present the narrative in their own way, but you still understand what is going on. It's just so good, and I'll have to reread it for the Gilmore Girls Challenge, and I cannot wait. Then I have Moby Dick. Yes, Moby Dick. It's amazing. Once again, surprised by how much this novel has stayed with me. I think about it very, very often. It's just such a funny, readable thing. A lot of people feel very intimidated. It is slow going. It doesn't have much of a plot. You read it for the accounts and the reflections, and the writing is so good. But also it has some very, very interesting, funny, insightful scenes. In case you don't know, this is about a narrator, Ishmael, and he's looking back at a time where he went on a whaling ship to capture this whale. It can be a metaphor for so many different things, but beyond just all the symbolism and all the things, it's just a plain fun read. Of course, I'm looking forward to reading it with a more critical mind and like analyzing all the religious references and like the pagan references and all the different references. You can totally read it that way, but you can also just take it as a really fun adventure book. And if you like that, please do give it a shot. Don't be intimidating, because it's actually very easy to read. Then I have Close Range by Annie Proulx. It was my first Annie Proulx, but it definitely won't be my last. This is a collection of short stories that include Brokeback Mountain, which is the reason I bought it in the first place, because I love that film. Makes me cry every time. And the short story is so great. It superseded my expectations, which were already quite high. But actually, that is not my favorite story. My favorite story from the collection is the story that comes right before, which is like 3 pages long and still makes my skin crawl. Apart from that, all the stories are amazing. I can tell Proulx is experimenting with the stories and the pace and the techniques. Most of them pay off super well, but as a whole, they leave you a Wyoming impression. And I've never been to Wyoming, of course, but I get the feeling I have been after reading these stories. They are so good and heartbreaking, but they are not suffering porn. They are just human stories with such great writing. I mean, oh, so good. So good. Then I have Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, and my edition was translated by Lydia Davies, and this I body read with Amelia from Amelia Reads. We had so much fun dissecting every little thing. I think this is one that, in comparison to some others I've talked about, gives me more of an intellectual pleasure. But I think the prose, first of all, is beautiful. Second of all, I think the way the psyche of the characters is explored is magnificent. It's just such a fun read. It is one book that I know I want to revisit over and over again. And I also think the fact that Madame Bovary is such a full realized character is so great, especially because I've been having the worst month reading flat female characters. I think I'm just appreciating it more at this point. So yeah, really read Madame Bovary, because it really is very, 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 very good. And I don't know French, but this translation has won awards, and it did read really, really well. My only qualm about this edition in particular is that it has endnotes, but it doesn't have the numbers on the page. So it's a bit like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be looking for. And there was one occasion which I said, oh, this must be on an endnote, and it wasn't. So just put the numbers. They are not that distracting. Then we have What We Talk When We Talk About Love by Raymond Carver. I get it now. I need to read every single short story Carver ever wrote, because the way he writes tension is unbelievable. All the stories, they aren't, of course, magical realism or anything, but they feel like reality could break at any time, because they are so tense that they are absurd to a point that it's almost unbelievable but not quite, and it's so good. And I also said this in my December wrap-up. All the stories are very different. Not in tone, they are actually similar in tone, but in content and in impact, and I was very surprised by how cohesive yet unique each story was. So completely recommended. If you like short stories, I mean, you can't go wrong with Carver. He's a master of short story for a reason. Then I have a book that I think you'll be surprised it's so down on the list, but I have my reasons, and that's The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. Out of all the books in this list, I think this is actually the one that is personally my favorite, and I think it is the book that I'm going to reread the most, and it's the only one that has the most straightforward potential to become an actual favorite, one book that I would reread over and over and carry with me in my heart, whatever. But I still think I need to reread it because I read it when I was on my own in New York, and like with So We Read On, I just want to make sure that it is as good as I remember before I bump it up, if that makes sense. I know it's my list and I can do whatever I want, but that is honestly how I feel. I remember a lot about what the book made me feel, but I need to reread it to make sure that all those things that seemed so charming to me are still in the book and it was not just a one-time thing. That all the layers and all the insights and all the playfulness with the narrative are there. By the way, I haven't mentioned what this is about. The narrator, who's a woman in her 50s, and her best friend, who was at a time his lover, but not really. They've had this very friends, pseudo boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, but not really. Fred was a womanizer and he's killed himself. Like him, she's a professor of writing in New York, and so the whole book is about storytelling, about writing, about literature with a capital L, and like what it means to our lives, especially in contemporary life. It talks about how teaching to new generations, where we've lost this idea that, okay, writing can really save you, or writing can have actual power, and is it good that we've lost it? Have we shed some really romantic elitist notion, or are we also losing something of value with that attitude? But it also has this plot of she's taking care of his Great Dane and she's not allowed to have dogs in her apartment. So it has a very fragmented style that shouldn't work, but it totally does, and even just talking about it makes me want to reread it because it's so good. I think I'm going to reread it very soon, so you'll hear me talk about it again soon. For now, I think it's a good spot. I also appreciate the fact that it is very readable. There was a time specifically where I just needed to keep reading as if it was a thriller. It's incredible. I just really enjoyed it. I recommend it. It also has some meta narratives there that are actually so smart. Again, it's that sort of thing that talking about it, I feel like it could have gone so wrong, but instead it went so right. So yeah, really recommend this one. Then I have Little Blue Encyclopedia by Hazel Jane Plante. This is a fake memoir of a trans woman who has lost her best friend, who is also a trans woman, and it's structured as an encyclopedia of this fake show called Little Blue. So it talks about the show, and it talks about her relationship with her friend Vivian, and Vivian in general as a human, and it's so good. It's, first of all, it's so moving. It's also so fun to read. If you like cultural criticism or memoirs or things that are a merger of the two, this is exactly that. I've read a lot of non-fiction books and I want to read more that are like this, but except this is fiction, it's all fictional, which is always interesting, you know, when you read something that so closely resembles non-fiction, but it's fiction and it's kind of why, but it's also so good and so well done and such a feat of imagination that you're like, yes, please give me more of this. The show is also bananas. So it's just a really different, fun, but also moving and poignant book. I really recommend it. It's also by an indie publisher, which I didn't know. And it's also Canadian, which again is uncommon for people who are outside of Canada. Like, we don't get enough Canadian books, I feel like. Again, it stayed with me. There are a lot of things that I remember very specifically. And that is not that common when you read hundreds of books a year, so yeah. Then Get in Trouble by Kelly Link. Another short story collection. I've had three now? Yes, it has been a good year for short story collections. They are crazy, and what I love the most about them is that they don't apologize for being strange. They don't try to over-explain the world. They just thrust you into this world. And sometimes these worlds are very bonkers and sometimes are very much like our own, but with a twist. But I always say that in spite of all the weirdness around it, the emotions it explores are very mundane or like very natural. So it explores envy, jealousy, senses of identity, family relationships. So they are not super strange at their core, but the worlds are unbelievably strange, but never gratuitously so. Like they have a point, and again, she doesn't over explain them, she just thrusts you into them. And I think that's the way to go. I love her confidence as an author, and her prose is just great. Once again, I think about these stories so much. They live rent-free in my mind, and oh, I really want to read this one as well. The next one is Love and Other Thought Experiments by Sophie Ward. This was one of those books that I didn't think I was going to love that much when I started it. I read it only because Mark Nash suggested it. Also because I was happy to see a lesbian couple in a book that wasn't about being a lesbian. I love coming out stuff, but yeah, it was just fun to see lesbians being people, because you know we are, and it shouldn't be something so hard to see, but it is. In any case, this is about a couple, Eliza and Rachel, and they are thinking about having a child and just generally moving their relationship to the next step when Rachel feels that an ant crawls into her eye, and Eliza tells her that that is not possible, but it's really important for Rachel that Eliza believes her in order to build their life together. That chapter, which is the first chapter, it's framed with the Pascal experiment related to the existence of God, and each chapter is framed in a different thought experiment, which is the thought experiment part of the title, and it works. It, again, could have gone so pretentious, could have gone so wrong, but it really is like each chapter plays out the experiment in a way that is so organic, doesn't feel forced, and you could even forget about the experiment and it would be just as great. But knowing the experiment, first of all, prepares you for what will happen, but also frames it in a very interesting way. It keeps that sense of suspense. It's really good. It has a couple of chapters that are a bit slow, so you have to walk through them, but after that it gets so good. I told you the summary, which is only for the first chapter. What follows next is completely insane, completely crazy. Once again, one of those things that it was a risk, but it paid off. So really, really good. Then we have Human Acts by Han Kang, translated by Deborah Smith, right? She translates all of Han Kang's books. This book makes me sad just thinking about it. I didn't think it was going to be so high up on the list, but here we are. This is about an uprising that occurred, I think, in the 80s in Korea, but in particular in the Gwangju province. It's often Seoul, which is highlighted as having been the center of the uprising against the dictatorship, but Gwangju also had its own uprising, and it was really important. And I didn't know anything about this before, and I need to learn more about it clearly. But yeah, it follows one of the kids who's killed his best friend. It also follows a young woman, back then a student, who was involved in a female-specific protest, which was brutal. It also follows a guy who was a political prisoner and a psychology or some sort of academia student who's trying to make their thesis on this guy, and it meditates on what memory means and what, you know, his intentions are good to preserve memory, but he's also re-traumatizing this guy who lived through this incredibly hard thing. It's just so good. It's very experimental, actually. It experiments with voice, but it doesn't mix too much. Each chapter is different and it has a different view. The last one is The Writer. It's so heartbreaking. Also, I don't know if you've followed Chilean politics, but 2019 was a very intense year. We're still going through it. It's not over yet. Probably never will, who knows? So reading it so close to that, it just made it hit closer to home. However, I still think it's a good book in its own right. Even if you didn't like The Vegetarian, which I know a lot of people didn't, everyone is entitled to their wrong opinion, I guess. This one is very, very different. The type of experimentation with narrative is also very different. So even if you don't like one, please give the other a shot, but in my opinion, they are both extremely good. Number 3, Another surprise for me that is so high, again, keep thinking about it. I told you last year's fiction books have just stayed with me so much. It's The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I hadn't read this before and I loved it. It's about this young woman. She's 19, so technically still a teen, and she's doing an internship in a magazine in New York. She's very bright and she would have a great future, except that her depression makes everything seem so dull. She doesn't have the motivation or the focus to pursue anything. And so she's drifting along in the city, and it chronicles that summer in her life. That's the first part. And the second part, she goes to get treatment at a mental institution. It's so good. The prose, if you know, Sylvia Plath was also a poet, but the voice is not extremely poetic. It's closer to a traditional, well-written coming-of-age story, insights on mental health, which I'll get to. They are amazing. But also it's insight into what it means to be a young woman in the 50s, trying to make it on her own in the sense of not having to get married to have a life. And all those sexual politics that go on, especially at such a young age, especially in New York. She's not a socialite, but because she works in the magazine, she moves in socialite circles, so it's all very interesting. And then there is the mental health thing, which, oh my god, if you've ever struggled with depression, you will see yourself in this, because even if you don't relate to the character on a personal note, if you are not similar to her, how she describes what depression makes you feel like, it's so on point. Actually, the metaphor of the bell jar, which is you have a jar on your head and you see everything dull and distorted, so good. Once again, one that I want to reread, one that I think about all the time. The second one, which is what I thought was going to be my favorite book of the year, and that is My Tender Matador by Pedro Lemebel. It is also the selection for this month's Reading Latinas book club. I'm going to link that video down below so you can check that out. When this video goes up, probably we will have already had that discussion. You can still join for the rest of the book club. You can also visit the Instagram, because Danny uploaded a lot of graphics with information about Pedro Lemebel and the historical context in Chile at the time that will help you understand the book better. In any case, this is about the Queen of the Corner, who is a gay man. He's older, he's past his 40s, I think. It's set during the dictatorship, and he meets this student, Carlos. He falls in love with him, but Carlos doesn't see him that way, at least at the beginning, but they do strike a friendship. So the Queen of the Corner helps Carlos with his revolutionary activities, which are very dangerous because it is a dictatorship. And those chapters are interspersed with a fabulous satirical narrative of the dictator thinking stuff and being very insecure about his masculinity. So it's a commentary also on masculinity and this military ethos that of course reigned during the dictatorship, but it's also still very relevant in Chile, and it's just so fun to read, but also so heartbreaking. It's so unique. I don't know how it reads in English, but in Spanish I've never read anything like it. It's so beautiful, but as I said, funny and ironic, and it's just so good. I really recommend it. I think it is the best Chilean book I read in my entire life. So you really do need to pick it up. Even if maybe you won't have that same effect or that same relationship with it that I have, I still think it's really, really good. Finally, number one, which I'm again surprised, but it is my number one book. It is an all-time favorite book now, and that is Selected Poems by Colette Bryce. Yeah, it is my first time having a poetry collection in my fiction top, or in my top of anything, I think. Maybe not, but definitely not number one. So that is incredible. So I love these poems. There are a couple poems that I know by heart now because they are so good and I read them so often. What I love about this collection in particular is that in spite of being a selection, it flows very well. It moves through the scope. Although, of course, the poems are very different because they are from many different collections. It can read a bit disjointed in that way, but some of these poems are ingrained in my soul. The way Colette Bryce uses imagery and sound and form, I'm in awe. I think she's so good. I love that she can write about very mundane moments, and I think those are my favorites, and then twist them a little bit so they become sweeter or eerier. She has also some that are more political, others that are more personal. So she has so much range, but all of them work. And I love this book so much. I've screamed about it to so many people. It's not even funny. So yeah, I really love this book. It's so good. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed it, please give a thumbs up. Please subscribe and comment. Have you read any of these books? And or do you want to read them after hearing me talk about it? Remember to check out the Bibliophile Daily, my podcast of short episodes of historical literary facts, and also all my social media. The books named and the videos mentioned will be listed down below. See you next time.